The reality is that TikTok-only records don't perform very well as an artist prospect. You've got to keep experimenting, and that's what makes the biggest tastemakers. It's better to be 8 out of 10 on the genius scale, but 100 out of 10 on the reliability scale, than to be an unreliable genius.
Hi, I'm Hazel Savage, and in this conversation, I'll be talking to household UK dance name Jules O'Riordan, aka Judge Jules. We'll cover the pitfalls and the legalities around being an artist, mental health for artists, and the importance of SoundCloud for A&R. So, I want to kick off. I'm going to also assume most people know who you are, but, and you'll have been asked this before, how do you like to introduce yourself? How do you tell people who you are and what you do?
Well, it's quite funny because I've been a DJ under the name, under my somewhat silly moniker Judge Jules for 3 decades, but as a lawyer, because I'm also, by day, I'm a specialist music lawyer, largely dealing in electronic music, but with a broader practice than that. I can't call myself judge because I'm not a judge. So I'm Jules O'Riordan, using my actual name. Whilst I might labour under some sort of weird fantasies about actually being a real judge, I don't think that's ever going to happen. And actually, I wouldn't have time to do it, even if it did.
I do think being an actual judge does sound like one of the coolest jobs ever.
Yeah, I think they might look at my raving past and think I was an inappropriate candidate for the job.
They would think you're coming to it from, name first, job second. And maybe they wouldn't like that approach.
But also, I think, my experience with judges was that, which despite being a sort of a qualified and practicing solicitor, is quite minimal because in the music business, very little reaches court. But I've been on... I did little bits and bobs when I was training to be a lawyer, and I've also done jury service. And I think the inherent problem I have is that judges are very serious and a bit po-faced, and I just couldn't be quite as stern as would be necessary.
Got it. So a bit from the historical perspective, did you train as a lawyer, decide to become a DJ, or did you have your DJ career and then come to law after it?
Well, I started promoting parties when I was 16,
Yep.
when you have loads of friends and very little to do. So if you can find the right venues, it's quite a captive market. I then went on to university. I studied law, really not at the time having any intention of going on to be a lawyer, but got the moniker judge because we were putting on illegal parties and one of my friends gave it to me. And I think the best nicknames aren't created by yourself, they're created by your pals, you know. So yes, I got a degree in law when I was 21, but I wouldn't say at 21, what on earth do you know about the future? I was already DJing quite profusely by that point. Did I think I'll never be a lawyer? Not necessarily. Did I think I'll never do exams in my goddamn life again? That I definitely thought, because exams are stressful. And of course I had to, ultimately, when I requalified about 15 years later.
Yeah, I hear you with that as well. Exams are very stressful, and I don't know if you felt the same way. Was there a pull towards law, or was it just this is a great academic degree with my results, I go in and I know I can do it, I've got some interest in it? Was that, do you even remember what your mindset was?
No, I think my mindset was probably determined by my parents, to be honest. I come from quite a broad generation of teachers. Like my uncle's professor at Oxford, my mother was a teacher, my auntie was a teacher, and I was one of these kids, dare I say it, who was quite academically okay, but your parents would always say to you, well, you've got to love your subjects. And actually I didn't really enjoy any of it. There was not one subject I could honestly say at school that I loved, but I was lucky enough to be okay at doing them. So if you are one of these people who can do all right academically without necessarily enjoying what you do, you may as well do something quite useful. And ironically, actually, a lot of the foundation of what you learn at law in doing a degree in law isn't very useful on a practical basis, because you're never going to do everything. So when you study law, you do criminal law, you do property law, you do a bunch of stuff that's kind of compulsory. And if you ever do become a lawyer, you're never going to do all of those. It's not like being a GP where you have to be a bit of a generalist, somebody who understands a bit of everything about medicine. No, that doesn't work with law. So, but that's why I did it anyway. Parental pressure.
And I wonder if this is true. So I considered doing a law degree but I ended up not doing. I ended up doing politics. But when I went and met with the law department, they said they didn't like people to have any previous experience because they said you get bad habits. And so I got the impression that if you're in the law sort of world, they want to train you a specific way and on specific things. Maybe that's a different take.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to bear in mind that I've got 2 law degrees. I had to redo my degree when I was in my sort of 30s, because by the time I got to the point of thinking, well, I'm interested in doing this as well as being a DJ, my previous degree was completely out of date. So when I was young, I was doing it very unenthusiastically, because I didn't want to be a black sheep in my family. Whereas when I was doing it older, and I've got young kids and I've got kind of when you're doing something for yourself as opposed to doing it because other people are expecting it of you, you tend to be more motivated.
Yeah, definitely. And I sort of love the way you describe, and I didn't know where your nickname or your DJ name had come from, but when you were running those parties and those illegal raves and getting that started, did that just feel like a very natural translation into, you started doing all this stuff at 16 and then the DJing became a part of that? Or was it a more sort of decisive, calculated, like, this is what I want for a career, I'm gonna push it in this direction?
I don't think when I started DJing per se, not being a sort of dance DJ anyway, was a potential career. There weren't any well-known dance DJs at the time. There were kind of smashy and nicey type radio DJs and some, and that was it really. Yep. But I think very similar to developing a music career now. The only way you're going to sort of make it and build a career and a brand for yourself is by doing it yourself.
Right.
If you think that other people are going to do it for you without at least having built some degree of brand up for yourself, it ain't going to happen, baby.
Yeah. I love it. And I think actually that we're jumping ahead to a question I had for later, but it's so spot on for what you were just describing, which is, I was interested in, with your sort of backgrounds previously as a DJ, still a DJ, and also with now at the law, how do you think that how much has the game changed? I guess is the DJ game I'm getting at.
Yeah, I mean, the DJ game's changed a lot from when I was a kid in every respect. The way that music is, the formats that music comes out in, the way music's promoted. I mean, I came from dance music really from the acid house, the raves in the late 80s. That was my genesis. And then it was a cottage industry. It was a cottage industry that actually generated some massive events, and suddenly overnight almost, dance culture in the UK in particular became enormously popular. But it was still a cottage industry. It was still kind of events put together by sort of amateurs. And I could spend all of this podcast talking about how things changed from then to now. But I think one of the most dramatic changes is now electronic music is part of the furniture. It's the Live Nations of this world, the kind of the major labels of this world, all the institutions of this world are very much invested, both metaphorically and physically, in electronic music culture, which is, and that's evolved completely from the days of a few sort of slightly geeky enthusiasts like myself doing what they were passionate about.
I think what's really interesting as well is, when I framed the question, how's the game changed, I felt there was a connection there where we looked at each other, and when we say the game, we both know what we're talking about in the music industry. It is those institutions, like you said, it's the labels, it's the clubs, it's the, people who were maybe not so interested when you were first starting out, and it's become an absolute, it's an industry in and of itself.
Yeah, and every year and they launch it at the IMS conference in Ibiza. They talk about the value that the AFEM, which is the trade body, the global trade body for the electronic music, does commissions a study of the global value of the electronic music industry. And I must say, it's come out this year. I didn't look at it this year, but it's circa kind of $6, $7, $8, $9, $10 billion a year. So it's a massive industry globally. So, I mean, that alone tells you all you need to know about how it's come on.
Yeah. And it's sort of obviously, being from SoundCloud myself, we know that dance music and all the various subgenres are the most popular music we have, especially in Europe and especially in the UK. You know, it really is what a lot of our platform is based on, and what the fans come for and what the DJs come for. I think as well, there's been a sort of a shift, like maybe even before my time and probably before your time, people used to be a little bit skeptical about electronic music or dance music, saying, well, it's not real instruments, or it's not, you know, you didn't learn the piano, it's just a synth or what have you. And I feel like we're coming round full circle with that in the way people talk a little bit now about AI. You know, and AI isn't real music. And I know I've jumped sort of a little bit to the tech here.
You're probably right. Yes, there are programs that can sing your vocals for you, speak your spoken elements for you, and of course, more recently, perhaps make your track for you. But I think it's we all know that that's going to become an increasing force within music making of all genres. But I just don't know quite what the impact is going to be yet, because the one thing that AI can't do is to evolve like an artist can, and both in terms of my own sort of creativity in terms of making records, but also the artists I see around me. I mean, there are every big artist that's out there. I could take just a handful of examples. I don't know, Patrick Topping or Solomon, who are two really big DJs. If you were to listen to them now, what they're playing and what they're making compared to 2 or 3 years ago, it's a dramatic shift, a dramatic evolution. I don't know that AI can do that. All AI can do is replicate what they've done now and what's out there in the ether now, whereas most artists are kind of testing out, especially DJ producers who've got the size of crowd to be able to test out music. They're testing out stuff now that is 3 months ahead of what's available in the marketplace, and that's what AI will never be able to do.
Yeah, and most AI only knows what you've taught it. It can only understand things it's been shown. It's not sentient or conscious in the way that, you know, a lot of the scare tactics in the tabloid press would have us believe. But I wonder as well if, in the same way that dance music has always been at the forefront of change, whether that was the illegal raves or, you know, sampling or synth music or whatever was pushing the boundaries of the technology. Do you, in your career as well, not just as a DJ, but from a legal perspective, do you see sort of today's modern stars and artists pushing those boundaries as well?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you can't but push the boundaries if you want to be a tastemaker. If you want to dwell on your sound from 18 months plus ago, then you are before very long, you will cease to be a tastemaker. You've got to keep evolving. Of course, you know, you're limited by the constraints of fairly obvious musical theory, you know, BPMs you've got to be within a certain spectrum of BPMs. You certainly can't evolve out of 4/4, but beyond that, really, you've got to keep experimenting, and that's what makes the biggest tastemakers.
Yeah, really interesting. And I wondered as well, obviously, at your company, Sound Advice, you are working with a lot of producers as well. Are you seeing innovation in the deal space in terms of what producers they're selling, they're putting together, they're packaging, they're offering, what they're coming to you with? How do you see any sort of evolution on that side as well?
Yeah, there are certain key things. I mean, first and foremost, if you and I go into the studio and we co-write a song, the likelihood is if I am just a songwriter and I haven't actually played anything, I'm only going to get a songwriting share. I'm not going to get a master royalty. You know, for those that don't understand, just breaking it down, there are 3 income streams, but for the purposes of now, let's talk about the 2 income streams. You've got a royalty from the master, the track, and you've got a royalty generated by writing the song. And certainly on other key platforms, those royalties are apportioned in a ratio 9-1. So for every 9p that goes to the master recording, 1p goes to the composition. And the writers of this world aren't very happy about that.
Right.
So what I have been seeing is songwriters, those with a bit of clout anyway, getting an entitlement to a bit of master royalty as well, which they weren't entitled to before.
Yeah.
So I think that's quite a big change. And that's in part down to how many more sort of collaborative type tracks that one sees over the past decade. In the past, you were either an artist who went into a studio, on your own, or maybe with an engineer.
Yeah.
You came out 2 or 3 days later, with the product of what you were doing. But now there's just so many more collaborative efforts. There are songwriting camps. There are kind of, let's bounce together as many different individuals as we can and see what sticks.
And is that as a result of the technology that's better, that allows collaboration to happen more often? You're not doing reel to reel, so you're not sort of limited by, we spent X amount on a deck. You can just keep recording digital tracks.
Yeah, I wouldn't say the hardware.
The
I wouldn't say necessarily the hardware, more the software. You can do it remotely more easily.
Yeah.
I mean, not only can you, I've made many records with other producers where you sort of bounce an idea back to them, they bounce it back to you, and eventually, after hopefully not too long, you come out with a finished product. But actually, you can do it all in real time now. I mean, actually, that's not a brand new development, but it's a more commonplace development.
Yeah.
Where you're both working on whatever software you're using. A lot of people use Logic, a lot of people use Ableton Live, and you're both working on it simultaneously on the same screen, potentially in totally different time zones and different countries.
Amazing. And I'm also very excited about what this song we're going to collaborate on is going to be like. Definitely happy to be fully sharing the songwriting and the master recording with you. I used to be in an all-girl punk band, so I'm really not sure what musical style we're going to come out with.
Yeah, I think our drum sounds might have a difference.
Definitely. But you know what? I mean, I'm gonna follow your lead on it. You got a little bit more experience. I'm genuinely excited what that collab would sound like. Brilliant. So I did also want to talk about a little bit, other than the challenges of the sort of the master recording and the songwriting. With your day to day of working at Sound Advice and the producers or the artists that you're dealing with, what are the other key challenges that people are coming to you with? Are you able to bucket it? Like, is it technology and AI? Is it deal terms? Is it major labels? Like, what are some of the other themes that
It's difficult because different creatives in different categories have got different challenges. I think because of my background, long-standing DJ, promoter, there's quite a long list, A&R for majors. I and various other bits, radio presenter and stuff. And lawyer. I try and sort of view things through the prism of my experience in the music industry as a whole, rather than be a sort of fairly sort of dry lawyer who can only kind of look at what the contract says. So a lot of the advice that one gives isn't strictly legal. It's how does one stick one's head above an unbelievably crowded parapet to make a difference? And really, you've kind of got to be. I try and avoid using too many sporting analogies, but I'm massively into football, but I think the following probably applies whatever type of sport you play.
Who's your team?
Arsenal.
Oh, okay, good to know.
Whatever you play at a professional level, you've just got to be good at everything.
Right.
It's no longer good to be good enough to make a great record, because you've got to be a relentless, very thick-skinned self-publicist. You've got to understand what lane your music sits in, because you can't simply just decide my music is great but not know where it's directed and where it's channeled. You've got to have great ideas, you've got to understand keys, you've got to understand, if you're in electronic music, you've really got to understand the dance floor. I mean, there are so many, there's such a multitude of skills. Many of those don't necessarily stem from an understanding of the business side of things, but one common denominator I've noticed in over the years, I've pre and post being a lawyer, I've known many globally successful musicians on quite close terms, and almost all of them are very savvy when it comes to business. Which isn't to say they'd necessarily do every last stitch in the fabric of their business. They have managers if they're lucky enough to have reached that stage, but they sure as hell, to the last man and woman, know precisely what it is about their business that they're doing. And so that's the one of those essential ingredients in that sort of basket of things you've got to be good at all of. I mean all of them if you want to be a successful artist. Maybe, if you're not successful, you might be good at some of them, which might make you a backroom producer, but might not make you an ideal candidate to be a successful artist. And it's really only that latter category where the legal side of what I do comes in. The rest of it is all understanding, is all based on my DJ background and other experience that I've had.
And so you're bringing in the experience you've had to kind of know a little bit what's required. And I wonder, something I've always stuck by, which works for me as a musician, but also as a tech entrepreneur, which is 9/10 of it's just showing up. Because I feel like, especially even in my industry, there's just so many people who they book a call, don't show up. They book a gig, they don't show up. They say they'll do something, they don't do it. And
do you know what? I totally believe in that philosophy. I think it's better to be 8 out of 10 on the genius scale, but 100 out of 10 on the reliability scale than the other way round.
100%.
Than to be an unreliable genius.
Yeah. Well, I've said that before. Like, I don't think I'm necessarily, the smartest tech entrepreneur out there. But if I've booked a meeting with a VC, I'm showing up and I'm coming prepared and I've done my work.
Yeah, and it's difficult because I'm very into the psychology of successful artists, and it's very personal because I lost my mother at 18, and a lot of the drive that I had towards being successful in what I do, I think comes out of that sense of loss. And there's a whole, if you look at the backstories of such a high proportion of successful artists, though, some degree of, I don't want to say tragedy, but sadness permeates the backstory of many, many successful artists. And of course, that same degree of sadness can cause some people's mental health to suffer to the extent that they might not be reliable. So it's difficult.
I sort of hear what you're saying. There's and I'm only applying it to myself. A certain amount gives you drive, but then there's probably a tipping point through at which point it becomes a disadvantage. And I was just thinking, I was hanging out with my mum yesterday, who I'm very lucky, 67, very lucky to still have her. And I was just with my mum, and this might be a TMI, too much information, but we were talking about how my dad grew up really poor. And he lived with his grandparents for a while. At one point, I said, and he had an uncle living with him. My mum was like, but it wasn't a real uncle. And my dad will not talk about his upbringing because I think it's just a little bit too much, too raw for him. And so his drive and determination comes from not wanting to be in poverty. And he's 100% past that to me in terms of that's how I operate and that's where I go. But so easily it could tip over into it's now overwhelming. And now, I've become, I've tried so hard to be reliable that I've just tripped myself up. I've overanalyzed.
Yeah, and there's an awful lot of, so especially if you're an artist going out there performing or making or creating, there's a lot of challenges to mental health that are, I think, unique to being an artist in that situation. I mean, I'll give you, I don't know if whether you saw the Avicii documentary, which is a really sad tale. One of the most talented artists ever in the electronic music world, a genius for creating riffs and commercially successful beyond the level of almost anybody within the electronic music world, but who found the touring element of it extremely challenging. And I've been in that situation where, you're performing in front of, well, in my case, probably 5,000 or 10,000 people in a foreign city, with this sense of elation, this sense of adrenaline, sense of self, if you like. Yeah. And then fast forward 2 hours, you're in a hotel room on your own, jet lagged, in a, completely with only yourself for company. And that, thankfully, I've always remained, probably by nature and not by nurture, by luck of birth, I've always been just on the right side of that situation.
Right.
But it's very challenging. To give another example, I mean, you have to be so thick-skinned to play your music to anybody, because the minute it's one of those classic kind of cliches. It's better to be talked about than not to be talked about at all.
Right.
But the problem is that a lot of that talk is going to be negative because it's the nature of the beast, and that's really tough for many, many people. And it makes actually being the front of house artist not appropriate for everybody, however talented that person might be.
Totally. And there was something similar in the Lady Gaga documentary as well, which is when she gets out on the stage, you suddenly you are the center of attention to tens of thousands of people. You're everything to everyone. Everyone's staring at you, and then you're in the hotel room, and nobody cares. No one's talking to you. You're completely alone. You feel like you could disappear and it wouldn't matter. And I just think going from one extreme to the other, that's where the sort of the mental fortitude must really sort of come into play.
Yes, and going back to your question, I think an understanding of that for me in my legal practice, where I'm kind of, I think you need to apply that as well to the conversation, to sort of. Client care sounds really cold, but that's the truth of it.
Yeah.
Having a broader picture of what it's all about, and not just being somebody who went to kind of law school and has been a lawyer all their life and might have a great grasp of what the deals are all about, but has zero grasp of the actual the deeper, bigger picture of what motivates most people in the artistic space, which so frequently is a sense of sadness or a sense of loss.
Yeah.
And not in every case, but I think it's so commonplace, and it's why mental health issues have to be sort of considered in the bigger picture of advising anybody. It doesn't mean I'm going to have a conversation with a client I've only just taken on and start talking about that stuff. No, I'd probably only talk about it with a select few people I've known and dealt with for a very long time. But you've always got it at the back of your mind.
Yeah.
An understanding of the way people's minds work.
And people are holistic as well, aren't they? They're not just the letter of the contract, the letter of the law, the letter of whatever's been agreed. It's the the intent and the meaning and the individual behind that as well. And like you say, their sort of enthusiasm, their sort of intention to deliver on it. The contract. I remember when I did my first fundraising round, there was like a lot more contracts than I was expecting there to be, and it was all, had to give incredible warrants for my co-founder. He's never been in debt, he's never done this, he's never done that. And so then you suddenly realise, I really have to trust this other person I'm going into this agreement with, and it can bring all these other issues out to the fore once you start looking at a legal contract and the things that you're agreeing to.
Yes, and I suppose the lawyers, where I'm like all lawyers, is that the mantra ultimately is hope for the best but prepare for the worst.
Absolutely.
Because more than 9 times out of 10 the best does happen, but in the 1 out of 10 or probably less occasions where the worst or something approaching the worst occurs, it's not just nasty, it can be incredibly psychologically taxing for an artist.
Yeah, and that's when the contracts come out then, isn't it? It's in the worst. It's what are we looking on? What did we agree to? What's our fallback position?
Of course. The reality of we've all watched Suits and watched these kind of legal dramas.
You're goddamn right, we have.
Rumpole of the Bailey. But in truth, especially in entertainment and in music, very little reaches court. You think, well, people are either happy and the contract continues for a while, or it ends in tears and everybody's waving the contract in the air metaphorically and wanting to fight with one another. But in fact, there's a sort of middle ground, which is far more commonplace, which is the relationship just peters out. It doesn't necessarily work for whatever reason, and it kind of peters out, and there's no acrimony whatsoever. It's just we agree to part ways, and we part ways quite amicably, and that is very commonplace. I'm pleased to say. The stuff we see in Suits is more for TV drama. Of course, it happens occasionally.
Definitely. And I noticed they had a formula in Suits as well. It was pretty much the same thing every episode. But
also it was.
I don't know how much it follows with real life.
I haven't watched loads of it, but it appears to be about lawyers who can do everything. Do everything from a traffic violation to like murder to buy and sell a property, deal with commercial disputes. Whereas actually, if you asked me to do the majority of those, I would have no more idea than you do. But if you want me to negotiate anything relating to the music business, dare I say, that I can.
Perfect. I love it. To me, I have watched a few episodes, although I stopped after maybe the first season because I realised they're all identical in terms of scenario. But mainly it seemed to be about having a catchphrase. So if we want to work on some catchphrases later on, I don't know if you've ever thought about having some sort of...
Well, I've only got one, which is the judge won't budge, which was my sort of long-standing Radio 1 catchphrase.
Well, so I love the Radio 1, but do you also use that as a legal...
Oh, God, no, remember, I cannot call myself a judge in my legal capacity.
Oh, yes, of course, we can't use the word judge. Yeah. Okay, no, well all right.
I don't think anybody would be silly enough to actually think I was a genuine judge. So I can be sort of humorous about it rather than be really sort of po-faced.
Actually, that sounds exactly like the sort of catchphrase that one of them on Suits would use. A real judge on Suits. I'm going to go and pitch it to HBO or whoever's handling that show. You'll get the royalty, of course. It's your catchphrase. All right, so I did want to... I know you mentioned briefly earlier that you did work in A&R for a long time. So I kind of wanted to touch on that sort of part of your career. And obviously with myself being from SoundCloud, I'm sort of applying my own lens to it as I'm looking at it. But I was kind of curious, how do you discover new music? And is that still a big part of your life? Is that something you still love to do?
Well, it is but in my DJ capacity, because I've been doing a syndicated radio show in fact, I recorded this week's episode yesterday. It's episode 1015. So
incredible.
That's getting on for 20 years. It's on SoundCloud as well, I should point out.
We love it.
So yes, I need to listen to new music constantly.
Yeah.
I mean, because of the time that my legal practice takes up and the volume of promos that come through, I've got a full-time PA who deals with the DJ side of what I do, so who will narrow it down to the sort of 150 tracks to listen to a week, as opposed to about 5,000 plus, because there's just so many.
Great.
And I think it's really, but on the general discovery point. And I'm not just saying this because we're doing it under the guise of SoundCloud. SoundCloud has become a massively important A&R source, and it's an interesting one. You see certain watchwords and sort of catchphrases within, pardon the pun, within the music business. And 2 or 3 years ago, it was all about TikTok. It was all, you just could not get away from the fact that if a record was performing well on TikTok, then the A&Rs would come swarming around it like bees to honey. And actually, fast forward to now and to recent times, and the reality is that TikTok-only records don't perform very well as an artist prospect. Yes, if you've got a record, an artist and a record that's already doing well, and then it gets TikTok support and gets that viral sharing, then that can be really helpful. But those records that only get big on TikTok don't have an artist proposition, because people aren't really visiting TikTok as music fanatics. Music is ancillary to the experience, albeit has a subliminal power. So fast forward to now, SoundCloud is obviously inhabited by music fanatics, to a lesser or greater extent, but you're there because you love music. And suddenly, so the kind of buzz chart within SoundCloud, which has existed to my knowledge for a while, has all of a sudden become just so important to the A&R fraternity, to record labels, big and small, looking to find new artists. Because that if an artist is performing there, it's because music fanatics like it. And if music fanatics like it, that's the beginnings of or at least the beginnings of an artistic career, as compared to TikTok, which is not about artists really at all.
So with TikTok, might you, again, even in your capacity at Sound Advice, has it kind of transitioned to individual track deals? Is that kind of where people have gone with it?
It has, yeah. I've done a number of TikTok deals where the record's done incredibly well virally on TikTok.
But it's the track, not the artist.
But it's track by track. And the interesting phenomenon of it is, so most of those sort of deals, so single deals, for those who are unaware, with major labels often work where they'll take a committed track, pay an amount of money for it, and then they'll have, one or more options to sign further artist tracks if the originally signed track performs well.
Yeah.
And I can say with certainty, because I've done so many of these deals, the option almost never gets exercised by the label, which is demonstrative of the fact that there isn't really much weight behind the artist. It's all about the track.
Yeah.
Whereas SoundCloud. I'm not being paid to say any of this. I genuinely believe it.
It's true.
SoundCloud is very, very much about artists and about the artist prospect and looking at an artist page and getting a feeling for what that artist is like sound wise. And it's and the irony is that I've been on SoundCloud with my global warm up radio show, mainly DJ stuff I've put on there, and it's always been very important to me. But I'd never really considered SoundCloud to be that important historically anyway, as a way of showcasing a genuine, an artist that's genuinely should I say, on the rise.
Yep.
It was always a great platform to say, here's my music, here's the link. It could be a public SoundCloud link, it could be a private SoundCloud link, but you never thought it was anything more than a convenient way of providing demos. But it's become so much more than that in the last sort of year to 18 months.
Well, that's really exciting. And are you seeing that from, when you get these, if you impressively listen to 150 tracks a week, as you're in your sort of professional capacity, is a lot of it coming in via SoundCloud?
No, it's predominantly, that's coming from labels. Yeah.
Coming from Oh, so they are just straight pitching.
Straight pitching to DJs.
Got it.
DJs,
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And in the same way that you might see the odd track deal, or several track deals coming through TikTok, are you starting to see deal flow in sound advice through SoundCloud?
Very much so.
Nice.
Very much so. And that's the real difference,
Yeah.
Whereas 18 months ago, as I just said, it was more, SoundCloud was there and there were countless tracks, countless artists, but it always felt like it was sort of artists who were just couldn't quite make it, if you know what I mean. Whereas now it's the most potent source of new talent out there. It's the only one really. There's not a parallel or not a similar product or platform.
Yeah, and I think that's what's exciting. I mean, we're out there with the sort of the figure of we've got 340 million tracks, which is more tracks by several hundred million than a lot of the other sort of online services. But also I wanted to kind of go sort of adjacent to that, which is, from an A&R perspective, if there are 120,000 tracks released every day, which is about the average, obviously you're getting pitched 150 a week or it's whittled down to that, just, that gets in front of you. What, if any, advice do you have? What can artists do to cut through that noise?
Well, I guess, I guess you need to, on a label front, as opposed to cutting through SoundCloud, because I think you'd probably be able to answer the best way to cut through SoundCloud better than I will, because I know you work on the AI side of SoundCloud. But on a label basis, some of the stuff is glaringly obvious. First and foremost, find out which labels are suitable for your music and have a very realistic approach towards that.
Yep.
And then probably even more important, find out who the style leaders are in your music. Who are the champions of that particular lane, because you need to be riding on the coattails of the tastemakers in your particular lane. And they may be club and festival DJs, they may be radio DJs. It's difficult with playlists on Spotify, Al, because it's quite difficult to get to the tastemakers there. And but you've got to work. But really, I think there are certain key influential independent labels, of which there are quite a number, and that should be where you should aim to pitch yourself in the long term. Yes, start with SoundCloud by all means, and don't abandon SoundCloud at any stage, but you want to do it in parallel with finding out who the scenesters are in your particular lane.
Yeah.
And if you don't, you just think, I'm going to put music out because I love making music. It's not going to work. You've got to understand the ecosystem, because dance music's got so many subgenres and so many sort of niches.
Yeah.
And you've really got to have a very solid understanding of what those are for you personally as an artist.
Yeah.
In fact, we need to have another separate conversation about how the monetization element of it works from SoundCloud, because I hear certain gripes from record labels.
Of course,
there's one label in particular, I won't name them, but they're one of the majors, who recently refused to allow me to create, if you like, a caveat to an exclusive record deal that I was doing for a client, allowing them to put stuff out on SoundCloud without limitation, because they argued that the royalties weren't flowing through. I mean, to me, that's a bit of a narrow view, and I didn't necessarily agree with it, but I couldn't argue. So
yeah. And we'll definitely pick that up separately as well, because in my capacity as kind of, tech whisperer at SoundCloud, I've been tasked with putting together a lot of the programs that really try and demonstrate how that money flows, but also how the value works. Because we're not just a slightly different version of Spotify, but we're also not TikTok. And so if you really look at it,
I mean, you're definitely not TikTok.
Exactly, but you need to look at it through a different lens. But that's hard, right? Because you're expecting major labels and industry execs and everyone to then understand your business model perfectly, to know where the value is. Where I think where we could do a better job, where we think, is if we can teach people where the value is.
Yeah, one thing I've encountered in legal practice is the fact that there are some, particularly, dare I say it, some older, so I'm older myself, but some people who are in the business affairs, the business decision making element of record companies, who are so embedded in the past that they really struggle with anything disruptive or any new way of doing things.
Yeah.
And I guess the advantage for me of being sort of the world's only active artist and music lawyer is that I don't need to sort of be stuck in one position, and I found that when streaming came along, which is around the first beginning of my legal career, when there were still deal parameters being kind of negotiated and counter negotiated between lawyers and record companies, I was very much part of that. But now there's yet new developments, and what SoundCloud is doing, particularly as it's become more of a conduit for actually making and breaking records. I do find it a little bit frustrating that some of the record companies can't. Yes, they've got to fight their corner, but that they don't kind of get that because they're so buried in the way of doing things in the past.
Yeah, it can be a real challenge. I worked for Pandora, the streaming service, over in Australia, and someone from a major asked me for a coffee one day at a conference, 9 a.m. Gotta love a 9 a.m. conference coffee. And I went along, and the first words out of their mouth was, music streaming's ruining the music industry. And I was suddenly very much on the back foot, not what I thought we were going to be talking about, but also 10 years ago, that was quite a common view. You just got people who out and out hated music streaming and felt perfectly happy telling you they hated it.
Yeah, and I can, as somebody who made a good living in the late 90s through to early noughties out of making music, as well as as a total separate income stream to live performance, and then we went into that kind of Napster era where nobody made any money out of music, and now fast forward 10 or 15 years or thereabouts, people are making money. So I think there were certain people who are quite bitter in that transition period, especially those probably who are a bit older, who might not have had enough career left in them to kind of see the upside of it all.
That's very true. If you look at the sort of the sales graph, it sort of was like, CD and retail, and then it sort of dropped off, like you say, down to that Napster era, and we're back up on the hockey stick now. So reasons to be joyful.
Or the broomstick, as the case may be.
I'm going to use that one. Okay, and I've got a couple more questions left. I think we've got a few more minutes. I know when we met the other day, you told me that something like, was it last year or this year, you're doing something like 53 live shows? Around that number?
No, this year's more like 80 to 100.
80 to 100. And there's only 52 weeks in a year. So my question is, how do you balance that level of live performance with your legal career at Sound Advice?
By being quite dull and organised, I think, is the only way of answering that.
Love it.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of travel. Next show, I'll be getting on a train. I often get the train somewhere and then get collected by a tour manager and driven home same night. So I'll sit on the train, with a table in front of me, and whereas most DJs will be listening to tunes, I'll be sat there with like a pile of documents that I'll be marking up with a
doing
red
some
pen.
red line.
Yeah, it's a bit of in the past, before I kind of worked out the logistics of doing these two full-time jobs in parallel,
right,
I couldn't really get my head around. I'd either be in DJ mode or I'd be in lawyer mode, but at weekends I had to be in a sort of hybrid of the two.
Yeah, and you must just absolutely love playing live to do that level.
Yeah, I've done more than 5,000 gigs in my time.
Yeah,
and no, I absolutely. You can't fool anybody, especially if you're in your 50s like I am.
Right.
You're not gonna continue to get booked and continue to sort of pull a crowd
Yeah.
unless you're genuinely into it. I don't want to be some, tired old rocker who's just rocking out the same old tunes.
I have heard, I don't know if it's true, but I've heard there's that famous story about Van Morrison, that if he gets booked for 2 hours, he has a massive clock side of stage that only he can see, and it's counting down, and literally when it hits 0, 0, 0, all zeros.
But he also performed with his back to the audience famously, didn't he?
Yeah, but when it hits 0, it doesn't matter if it's in the middle of a song, he will just down tools and he is gone. And I think, well, people probably still pay to go and see him because he's a bit of a legend, but that's who you never want to be, right?
Absolutely.
I can't picture you with that countdown clock back to the audience.
No, my problem is I will be looking at my watch, but for completely the opposite reason. I'm thinking, no, I don't want this to end.
I could squeeze a few more tracks in here, like, well, how much will they let me go over? That sort of thing. All right, brilliant. Well, just my last sort of couple of questions. I did want to ask you, I know you've told me before, but for the benefit of the audience, setting up your first ever studio. When you were first starting your career in music and becoming a DJ, was it similar to the studio we're in now? We're in a very sort of nice little podcast studio here.
Yeah, I'd say the walls and the floors and the glass bit were the same. The glass bit through to the control room are the same, but all the hardware was completely different. I mean, I was lucky enough to be DJing a lot so we're talking like, I don't know, very late, probably very early 90s.
Yep.
I spent 100k, which was a lot of money. It's a lot of money now. It's a lot of money
now,
then,
yeah.
but I was even then I had a lot of gigs, and I sort of saved and bought studio equipment then that now you would get almost for free as downloads in a laptop. That's how much the hardware there wasn't so much software then. It was virtually, there was a little bit of software for sequencing, and that was it. There was no hard disk recording of any. You could record tiny snippets. That was it. So it's an interesting one because on the one hand, back then, not many people could have afforded to do what I did. I was lucky enough to be DJing a lot then, and that basically paid for it. I was sort of living semi with my parents at the time.
Yeah.
Or parents. But fast forward to now and a sort of democratisation of music making, whereby everybody can kind of make tunes. Is it a better or a worse thing? Theoretically, it's better that it's open to everybody regardless of their means, but that does also result, especially with the likes of Splice and slightly, significant shortcuts to music making, that there's just so many tunes now. There's so many kind of 6.5 or 7 out of 10 tracks now.
Right.
But I don't think there are any more 9 or 10 out of 10s than there ever were.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. I like the way of thinking about it. Yeah, because the 9 out of 10s are the 9 out of 10s and the 10 out of 10s, and they would have existed anyway. But now maybe there's just more hobbyists, more prosumer.
Yeah, and there's very few. I mean, there used to be such a massive sort of difference between, you'd either get great records or terrible records.
Yeah.
And back in the day, it was my poor postman used to arrive with this sack of promos every day. He's probably sued the Royal Mail since then, because that's how music was promoted to DJs.
Yeah.
And you'd sit there with your Technics 1200s and you'd go through them. It was quite a slow process because you've got to take them out the sleeve, take them out the bag, put them on the record player, flick through it, probably scratch the record as you were going through it with your stylus. Right. But there was this real obvious distinction between the crap and the good records.
Right.
Now it's there's very few tracks of less than 6.5 out of 10.
Yeah.
But that doesn't make them good. It makes them on the upper scale of average.
Yeah, I'm already seeing an infographic, a data post in my head about how I can visually represent this with volume, because like you say, the volume now is there, but maybe it's the breakout hits are still the breakout hits.
They are. Indeed.
Nice. All right, one final question.
Sure.
So I'm going to call this question "Stories from the Vault." Could you just share with us a particularly memorable gigging experience? Can be for good reasons, for bad reasons.
I think let's go for a good one, which was
nice.
DJing in front of the pyramids of Giza in Egypt, next to the first ever dance music event. only the two other artists who were Sting and Jean-Michel Jarre had ever played in this location. It's like, I mean, it's a horrible analogy, but can you imagine what a packet of Camel cigarettes looks like?
Yeah.
If you draw like a DJ booth in front of that was me. And at the end of the night, I overshot a little bit time-wise, and it got closed down by police on Camelback.
Wow. Okay. Wow. Like, so the Camel cigarettes analogy's coming full circle there. That's incredible. And what a phenomenal experience as well. Yeah, life's for living. I absolutely love it. Well, thank you so much, Jules, for sharing with us some of your story from Sound Advice, your work as an A&R, your work as a radio DJ, and your work as an actively gigging DJ. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you kindly.
Thank you so much.